June 22, 1941. Brest Fortress, Western Soviet Union. Dawn had barely broken when the world caught fire. The sky glowed orange over the Bug River. Smoke rose in twisting columns. A young Soviet border guard, Sergeant Pyotr Gavrilov, 31 years old, pressed his back against a shattered wall. Dust drifted over his uniform. His rifle, a battered Mosin Nagant, trembled in his hands. A whistle screamed overhead. Then thunder. German Stuka bombers tore across the sky, dropping the first bombs that would open the most brutal front in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Gavrilov lifted his head and stared into the inferno. Behind him, the red brick fortress groaned under collapsing stone. Ahead, thousands of German infantry poured forward in perfect formation. Yet he did not run. He whispered to himself the same words countless Soviet soldiers would speak in the terrible days ahead. The war is just beginning. The Soviet Union, unprepared, fractured, wounded, was about to be crushed by a war machine that seemed unstoppable. But in the ruins of Brest, in the forests of Belarus, in the factories of the Urals, another machine was awakening. A machine powered by steel, sweat, starvation, and sheer unbreakable will. This is the story of the Soviet war machine that never stopped. By mid-July 1941, the Soviet Union was collapsing. 3 million German soldiers surged eastward. Thousands of Soviet aircraft burned on runways. Entire armies disintegrated in days. Marshal Timoshenko wrote, "We are fighting, but we are not yet at war." The Soviet command system was broken. Officers had been purged. Communication lines severed. Logistics crumbled. Cities fell faster than the high command could mark them on maps. Minsk, lost. Smolensk, encircled. Kiev, surrounded by the largest pocket in military history. For every mile the Wehrmacht advanced, Soviet factories were pushed further back. Ordered to disassemble, load onto trains, and flee. Workers slept beside machinery. Families clung to the sides of railcars. Entire factories rolled eastward like steel caravans. The Soviet Union was not defending itself. It was surviving its own destruction. From July to December 1941, the Soviet Union carried out the largest industrial evacuation in human history. 1,523 factories were uprooted. Millions of workers moved east. Trains stretched for miles. Smoke drifting across endless steppe. At Magnitogorsk, workers hammered machines into frozen ground. At Chelyabinsk, tractor factories were reborn as tank assembly lines. At Sverdlovsk, women welded steel plates in temperatures that froze breath into ice crystals. Soviet engineers said, "We did not build a factory. We built a weapon." This was the beginning of the machine that never stopped. By early 1942, the Urals roared like an industrial storm. Here, the Soviet war machine took shape. The KV-1 heavy tank, welded under snow-laden roofs. The T-34, stamped from plates still warm from the furnace. The PPSH-41 submachine gun, rolling off lines by the thousands. Production never paused. Not for air raids, not for shortages, not for death. Women worked 12-hour shifts, then slept on factory floors. Elderly men shoveled coal into furnaces with hands blistered raw. Teenagers carried ammunition belts over their shoulders like lifelines. They were the unseen soldiers of the Eastern Front. Joseph Stalin, grim and unyielding, declared, "We need more machines, more armor, more fire." And so the factories answered, day after day, night after night. September 1941. Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution, was surrounded. No food, no fuel, no escape. 1 million civilians trapped in a siege that would last 872 days. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. People collapsed in the snow, starving before sunrise. Bread rations fell to 125 grams, half sawdust. Yet inside the besieged city, factories still worked. The Kirov plant produced tanks under artillery fire. Workers welded armor while shells screamed overhead. When glass shattered, They swept it aside and kept assembling turrets. The city was dying, but the machine did not stop. The winter of 1941 to 42 froze the German advance outside Moscow. For the first time, the Red Army could breathe. Fresh divisions arrived from Siberia, hardened by cold, trained for survival. Soviet commanders regained confidence. The T-34 proved nearly unstoppable in snow and mud. A wounded giant was rising to its feet. But the war was far from won. August 23, 1942. Stalingrad burned under the fire of 1,000 German aircraft. The city shook as if the earth itself were cracking open. Amid the smoke, Soviet troops clung to every floor, every staircase, every ruined factory hall. The Red October steel plant did the unthinkable. It continued producing weapons while the battle raged inside its walls. Workers built tanks in the morning. Soldiers drove them straight from the factory into combat by afternoon. In the grain elevator in Pavlov's house in the tractor factory, the Soviet machine showed its true nature. Not precision, not efficiency, but endurance, brutal, stubborn, endless endurance. General Vasily Chukov growled, "We will fight for every brick." And they did, until the German Sixth Army collapsed under the weight of a machine that refused to stop. Summer 1943. Hitler prepared Operation Citadel, hoping to crush the Soviet bulge at Kursk. But the Soviet war machine had changed. Behind the lines, intelligence networks, radio intercepts, and partisan scouts fed information into a rapidly improving command system. Factories worked at maximum load. Tens of thousands of mines laid. Miles of trenches dug. Armies positioned with mathematical precision. July 5, 1943. The German attack began. The fields thundered with engines. The Tiger and Panther rolled forward. But wave after wave of Soviet armor countered. T-34s swarmed like steel predators. Anti-tank guns fired until barrels overheated. At Prokhorovka, tanks collided at point-blank range. Metal grinding against metal, turrets blowing off in pillars of flame. It was war reduced to pure industrial force. By the end, the Wehrmacht was bleeding steel it could never replace. The Soviet machine was only accelerating. June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa. The Red Army unleashed Operation Bagration. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers surged forward. Thousands of tanks, guns, trucks, all born from the machine the Germans thought they had destroyed in 1941, rolled across Belorussia. German lines shattered. Entire divisions vanished. Bridges collapsed under the weight of Soviet armor. In 6 weeks, the Germans lost the heart of their Eastern Front. Berlin trembled. By late 1944, Soviet soldiers crossed into German soil for the first time. They carried memories of burned villages, of murdered families, of children shot on the steps of their homes. The machine pushed forward with terrible force. Cities fell. Lines broke. German morale collapsed under the storm. But victory came with shadows, revenge, discipline broken, civilian suffering. The machine's power was overwhelming, but not without a human price. April 1945. Berlin burned like a dying star. Soviet artillery pounded the city until streets became rivers of rubble. T-34s maneuvered through fire-like corridors. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Soviet flags unfurled over broken statues and shattered marble. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life in the bunker beneath the ruins. On May 2, Berlin surrendered. And on May 9, the Soviet Union declared victory. But the war machine, the machine that had carried the nation through 4 years of terror, did not stop. From the ruins of Brest Fortress, to the snows of Moscow, to the factories of the Urals, to the broken streets of Berlin, the Soviet war machine endured what no nation should endure. It survived starvation, executions, defeats on a scale the world had never seen, losses that defy comprehension, 27 million dead. But it kept going. Through fear, through sacrifice, through an iron will to survive. In the end, it was not genius strategy, nor flawless engineering, nor perfect leadership. It was something harder to measure. a machine built from the strength of millions, who refused to stop even when the world was ending. May 1945. The guns fell silent. The smoke faded. But the cost of victory lay everywhere. Across the fields of Europe, across the cities of the Soviet Union, across the lives of millions. Entire villages no longer appeared on maps. Factories lay in ruins. Railways twisted like broken ribs across the landscape. In Kiev, mothers searched for the names of their sons on lists nailed to shattered walls. In Stalingrad, the Volga flowed past mountains of debris that once were apartment blocks. In Leningrad, survivors walked the streets like shadows, thinner than memory. And deep in the Kremlin, Stalin prepared a new speech for the nation. A cold reminder that the struggle had not ended. We must rebuild. We must strengthen. We must prepare. The war machine, soaked in blood and triumph, was not allowed to rest. Not even for a moment. What the Germans destroyed, the Soviet Union rebuilt at a pace the world had never seen. The Ural industrial belt, which had carried the burden of wartime production, now became the beating heart of reconstruction. In the ruins of the Donbass mines, workers dug through collapsed shafts with their bare hands. In Belarus and Ukraine, teenagers rebuilt bridges plank by plank. In Moscow, women hauled bricks into piles 12 hours a day, the same women who welded tank hulls during the war. Millions were exhausted. Millions more were grieving. But the machine demanded movement. And so the Soviet Union plunged into an industrial surge that mirrored the frantic pace of wartime manufacturing. Blast furnaces roared back to life. Steel output climbed. Coal production soared. Railways were restored across a continent-wide graveyard. It was not hope that drove the nation. It was necessity, and fear that the next war was already forming over the horizon. Victory in 1945 left the Soviet Union with a massive army, but not a modern one. Though hardened by war, equipped with thousands of T-34s and heavy artillery, it lacked the technology required for a new kind of battlefield, one shaped by jets, rockets, radio warfare, and atomic fire. So the Soviet war machine, that relentless engine forged in 1941, evolved again. Old tank factories shifted to new designs. The T-54, the future backbone of Soviet armored power. Artillery units modernized their guns. Engineer battalions rebuilt roads as fast as they destroyed them. By 1948, the Red Army was no longer a defensive force. It was a superpower's fist, massive, disciplined, and technologically accelerating. Western observers whispered, "The Soviet Union can replace its losses faster than we can count them." The machine had changed shape, but it had not slowed. As Europe lay divided, a frost settled across the world. The Soviet war machine, rebuilt, electrified, strengthened, now faced a new adversary. The United States, two giants, forged in opposite fires, now stood on either side of a broken continent. The Soviet leadership believed the next conflict was not a possibility, but an inevitability. Factories expanded. War production plans adapted. New armored corps formed. Strategic aviation grew. The machine learned new rhythms, quieter, more calculating, powered not by desperation but by global ambition. In this new age, a simple truth remained. The Soviet Union could not stop. It did not know how to stop. Stopping meant death. The world it shaped, and the scars it left behind. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's two superpowers. The unstoppable war machine of 1941 to 45 had transformed the nation into a nuclear power, an industrial titan, a military empire. But behind the steel and pride lay the shadows of what it cost. Families torn apart, generations wiped out, millions buried in anonymous fields, cities rebuilt over mass graves. The Soviet war machine defeated Nazi Germany, but it consumed its own people in the process. And yet, in every memorial park, in every eternal flame, in every photograph of women welding steel under snow, in every rusted tank standing silent in a village square, the story is the same. It never stopped. Not when the enemy invaded. Not when cities burned. Not when hunger stalked the land. Not even when victory came. 1945. The war was over, but for the Soviet Union the march continued. Red Army boots echoed through the streets of Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, Bucharest, Sofia, and the heart of Berlin. Soviet tanks, painted with victory slogans and battle scars, took positions from the Baltic to the Balkans. What began as liberation became administration. What began as occupation became transformation. What began as victory became empire. Factories in East Germany were dismantled and shipped east. Coal mines in Poland were reorganized for Soviet strategic output. Railways across Eastern Europe were rebuilt to Soviet gauge standards, a reminder that Moscow could move men and machines across borders without pause. The Soviets called it security. The West called it expansion. But the truth was older and deeper. The Soviet war machine did not know how to stop. It had learned only one direction, forward. And forward it moved, reshaping a continent scarred by war. Winston Churchill would later call it the Iron Curtain. But long before the words were spoken in Fulton, Missouri, the curtain had already descended. Watchtowers rose along borders. Checkpoints hardened. Armored divisions stood ready day and night. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, a fortified line emerged, not built of steel and concrete, but of ideology and memory. The Soviets believed Western invasion was still possible, still imminent, still waiting for the right moment. The war machine, bruised but victorious, now operated with one purpose: never again allow an enemy to reach Soviet soil. Every factory, every regiment, every political decree echoed the same lesson learned in 1941. Survival requires strength, and strength requires endless motion. August 29, 1949. Semipalatinsk test site, Kazakhstan. A blinding flash illuminated the desert. The ground rumbled like distant thunder. Mushroom clouds curled into the sky. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. Behind the achievement were scientists like Igor Kurchatov, engineers working in secrecy, and thousands of laborers who never knew what their hands were building. But behind them, the machine pulsed. Industrial complexes in the Urals refined uranium. Railway lines carried equipment day and night. Special factories designed warheads with the same relentless rhythm once used for T-34 tanks and Katyusha rockets. The Soviet war machine had entered the atomic age. Privacy vanished. Speed intensified. Pressure multiplied. Stalin demanded an arsenal that could rival the United States. He demanded the impossible. And the machine delivered. For the first time, the world feared not invasion, but annihilation. 1950. The Korean Peninsula exploded into conflict. To the world, it was a war between North and South. But behind the lines, the Soviet machine hummed. Trains loaded with ammunition crossed Siberia. Soviet pilots flew MiG-15 jets from airfields in Manchuria. Advisors supervised tank brigades armed with T-34 divided by 85s. Anti-aircraft crews tracked American bombers with deadly precision. Though the Soviets avoided open declaration, their fingerprints marked every battlefield. For the first time in history, the machine that rose to fight Hitler now powered a conflict on another continent. Its reach was no longer regional. It was global. March 5, 1953. Joseph Stalin, the architect of Soviet steel, terror, and victory, died in his dacha near Moscow. First, the machine slowed. Mourning, confusion, power struggles. Factories paused their endless shift cycles. Military units waited for orders no one was prepared to give. The war machine, for the first time since 1941, hesitated. But only for a moment, because the machine was no longer Stalin's creation. It had outgrown him. It had outgrown any single leader. By the late 1950s, under Khrushchev, the machine redirected itself, from tanks to rockets, from artillery to satellites, from mass armies to nuclear missiles. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the world's first artificial satellite. It was not merely a scientific triumph. It was a statement. The war machine had left the Earth. By the 1960s, a new generation walked the streets of Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, and Riga. They did not remember Brest Fortress, or the winter outside Moscow, or the firestorm at Stalingrad. But they lived among the ruins rebuilt. They traveled on trains powered by wartime rails. They studied in schools funded by post-war labor. They flew planes developed by wartime engineers. They inherited a world shaped by a machine that had carried the Soviet Union through its darkest hour. In murals, in statues, in Victory Day parades, the machine became myth, a story of resilience, of survival, of sacrifice beyond understanding. Yet behind the glory lay the simple truth. The Soviet war machine never stopped because it could not stop. It had been forged in the fire of invasion, fueled by the fear of annihilation, driven by the memory of a nation nearly destroyed. And so it continued decade after decade, long after the war had ended. October 1962. For 13 days, the world stood inches from destruction. Deep inside Soviet bunkers, technicians checked missile guidance systems. In Cuba, soldiers unloaded crates marked with Cyrillic letters, warheads capable of leveling entire cities. In Moscow, generals reviewed plans not for battles, but continents. The Soviet war machine, once built to repel invaders, now prepared for the unimaginable. A nuclear confrontation with the United States. On the surface, diplomacy danced. Behind closed doors, panic whispered. But underneath it all, beneath the politics, beneath the speeches, beneath the threats, the machine pulsed with the same rhythm that drove it through Stalingrad. Never show weakness. Never surrender ground. Never stop. The crisis dissolved, but its shadow remained. For the first time, humanity witnessed what the Soviet war machine had become. Not just an arsenal, not just an army, but a force capable of ending civilization. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union no longer relied on millions of troops marching across plains. The machine evolved into something colder, quieter, sharper. Missile silos dotted the Siberian wilderness. Submarines armed with nuclear warheads drifted beneath Arctic waters. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, R-16, R-36, SS-18 Satan, became the new armored spearheads. Factories once producing T-34 tanks now built guidance systems, engines for long-range rockets, materials for spacecraft. The Soviet war machine had entered an age where war was measured not in bodies, but in megatons. At its peak, the Soviet Union held more tanks than the rest of the world combined, the largest army on Earth, the most powerful nuclear missile ever created, a navy capable of patrolling 3 oceans. The machine had grown far beyond its origins. It was no longer just steel, no longer just soldiers. It had become a system vast, interlocking, unstoppable. 1979. The Soviet war machine rolled into Afghanistan, confident and massive, a giant entering the mountains. It expected a familiar enemy, a familiar battlefield, a familiar kind of victory. But the valleys and peaks of Afghanistan did not care about Soviet steel. They swallowed convoys whole. They hid fighters in caves older than empires. They turned modern war into a struggle of attrition. Helicopters were ambushed in narrow passes. Columns found themselves trapped on roads carved into cliffs. Supply lines stretched thin across landscapes that offered no mercy. For the first time since 1941, the machine hesitated. Not because it lacked firepower, but because firepower meant little in a war without front lines. Mothers in Moscow received letters sealed with silence. Soldiers returned home as shadows. The Soviet people felt a familiar ache, the weight of a war that promised nothing but loss. Afghanistan did not destroy the Soviet war machine, but it cracked the illusion of its absolute power. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was exhausted. The machine that once rebuilt cities, crushed armies, and launched satellites had become a burden, a colossal organism requiring endless resources to survive. Economies strained, factories slowed, lines for bread stretched across cities. Republics whispered the word Moscow feared most. Independence. 1989. Berlin. A wall built by fear and guarded by Soviet soldiers, crumbled before the world's eyes. 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved, and the war machine, once the largest military force on Earth, fractured into 15 nations. Tanks rusted on abandoned bases. Warheads were dismantled under international agreements. Headquarters fell silent. For the first time in half a century, the machine stopped, not because it was defeated, but because the nation that fed it, the nation that needed its strength to survive, ceased to exist. Today, the world remembers the Soviet war machine through the echoes left behind. Cemeteries stretching beyond horizons. Rusting armored hulls beside village roads. Monuments rising above snowy plains. Cities rebuilt from ashes. Survivors who lived through the unimaginable. The Soviet war machine changed history. It broke empires. It liberated nations. Crushed tyranny. It reshaped science, technology, and geopolitics. But it also devoured millions of lives. It demanded sacrifice without measure. It turned a nation's fear into industry, and industry into power. In museums, schoolchildren touched the steel of tanks that once fought at Kursk. In Russia, on May 9th, veterans march with medals that shimmer like tiny suns. In Eastern Europe, the memory of liberation and occupation lives in uneasy balance. And across the world, the phrase Red Army still resonates like a distant drum. The Soviet war machine did not simply fight a war. It became the symbol of the war itself. Unstoppable, relentless, forged in desperation, driven by the will to survive.